I want you to imagine yourself in a world where zombies are real. Imagine you live in a world where an undead plague has completely ravaged the world and destroyed civilization as we know it. Now, imagine that it's 10 years later. It's morning in your suburban home. You're drinking your coffee, getting ready to commute to work. You're scrolling through the news on your phone, and you see an article saying that a zombie just washed ashore on Vancouver Island, only to get immediately put down by the lifeguard. You think to yourself, damn, how long has it been since a Zed washed up on shore? And you go about your day. This is the world of World War Z, a world where mankind stared death in the face and won. This is a setting where the world has been unquestionably changed by the outbreak of a devastating zombie plague, but where men and women now go about their lives just as before, with a very minimal threat of being attacked. It's a world where everyone has lived through hard times, and everyone knows what to do when they see a zombie, so much so that it's almost banal. It's a world that might soon forget the horrors of the zombie war if no one is around to record the voices of those who were there. World War Z is presented as a series of interviews taken well after the conclusion of the zombie war. By placing the book in a time well after the war has already been won, author Max Brooks took a huge risk. He was writing a horror novel in which the outcome was already known from the very start. What's more, it was a generally positive outcome. But Brooks' approach to the zombie novel allowed him to do something that no zombie media has done before or since: write an engaging, realistic history of a desperate fight against the living dead. He created a zombie novel that reads like a documentary. Inspired by Studs Terkel's very real book, The Good War, An Oral History of World War II, Brooks created a piece of fictional history that is still unmatched to this day. It is a singular book. Any attempt to copy it would be immediately recognizable and almost certainly inferior. Today, it's my goal to explain to you why there will never, ever be another book like World War Z, An Oral History of the Zombie War. Every zombie story features some kind of pathogen or some other way that these zombies are created. What is the nature of the zombie outbreak? A virus is often taken for granted, but what about other causes? Parasites like the cordyceps fungus in The Last of Us, or those seen in the Korean series Kingdom, come to mind. Could radiation from space, as in Night of the Living Dead, or a kind of toxin, as in Return of the Living Dead, be the cause? Choosing the vector of the disease allows us to also choose the symptoms of the illness and how quickly it spreads. It might spread gradually. It might infect the whole human race, activating only upon death, as in The Walking Dead. Brooks's decision was actually so old school that it looped back around to being brilliant. His virus, Solanum, is contracted only through fluid contact with the already infected. It creates slow, lumbering zombies with a degree of intelligence even lower than that found in Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Infected are only capable of grabbing and attempting to bite uninfected organic life. They are also immune to damage to the body, requiring the functional destruction of the brain to overcome. However, one thing that Brooks did very well is that he made the Solanum infection unique based on where an individual was bitten. There is no one-size-fits-all Solanum infection. Some are slow burns, where the virus takes days to finally pass through the system. Others are infected very quickly from having been bitten near the brain or in a major artery. This causes many problems as people foolishly think they have beaten the virus somehow, or sneak by unnoticed to cause outbreaks elsewhere. One thing that was excellent here is how long it can take before symptoms show up. It leads to the virus going undetected and spreading around the world, people taking planes to other countries without their wounds being recognized. One of the narrative problems we find in a lot of modern zombie films is the incredibly fast infection time, wherein being bitten leads to almost immediate reanimation. and that this precludes the infection from becoming a global problem. For example, if you take the zombies from 28 days later, the rage virus affects people in a matter of seconds. This makes it functionally impossible for the zombies to somehow find their way to. With the infection happening instantly, there's little opportunity for the infection to spread on boats or through the air, on airplanes. Solanum incubation, being dependent on the quantity of the virus and its access to major arteries, allows an explanation for the international spread of the virus. Sometimes it just worked too slowly to be detected. Now, what are the characteristics of Solanum? This is interesting because it functions almost identically to the wildfire virus from The Walking Dead, and both viruses were invented in 2003 with the publication of the Zombie Survival Guide by Max Brooks and The Walking Dead in the same year. But Solanum works its way up into the brain stem, taking control of brain cells there while destroying the rest of the brain. The virus places the body into a coma until it destroys enough of the brain to cause brain death. In a few hours, the reanimated brain reactivates, causing the dead body to rise. The virus-controlled brain then begins generating electric signals that move the body for one purpose: to spread the infection to the still living. Well, it's not quite that simple. You see, the Solanum virus does not direct the infected body towards those whom can be infected. Rather, it attacks all moving life, and indeed all signs of life. Loud noises attract the undead, as does any kind of movement, not just the movement of the living. They are drawn by the scent of all living creatures as well, not just human beings. One can think back to that scene in Night of the Living Dead where one of the zombies munches on a cicada or a cricket. I can't exactly remember what type of insect it is. The insect can't be infected by the zombies. Of course, in Night of the Living Dead, it's not really an infection, it's more caused by radiation, but you get my point. Basically, the zombies want to eat everything that moves, and it's the same in Brooks's story, even though we're now dealing with a virus. So Solanum is a threat to not just humanity, but to all life. The choice of using a virus as a vector for his zombies has paid off well for the relevance of Brooks's books. His research into the SARS pandemic paid off beautifully, as the pandemic in World War Z has an eerie resemblance to another coronavirus outbreak, the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. The spread of Solanum around the world bears great similarity to pandemics in our own reality, where attempting to stop the spread to other countries seems like an impossibility. In the post-COVID world, we see incredible similarities to our own situation during that pandemic, especially in the early stages of World War Z's narrative. Now, what is one thing that sets World War Z apart from other zombie stories? Well, a big part of it is the way in which the story is told. World War Z is neatly divided into chapters, each focusing on a different part of the zombie war. And each of these chapters is broken up into interviews with different characters. First is the introduction, which explains why our narrator, Max, let's call him, is writing his own book a decade after the official end of the zombie war on Victory in China Day. The next chapter, Warnings, consists of interviews describing the very earliest outbreaks in Dachang, China, human trafficking in Tibet, a special forces encounter in Afghanistan, and the beginning of the South African outbreak that finally got the world's attention. It also tells of how the Warmbrunn Night Report was published, a collaboration by various experts to gather information on the so-called African rabies virus and prepare for its spread. And we learn that Israel, alone of the world's major powers, takes the report deadly seriously. The second chapter is Blame, a chapter primarily focused on the people in power who allowed the catastrophe to happen. Focus falls on the CIA, the People's Republic of China, the White House, and Congress, as well as an opportunistic con man who tries to sell people a fake vaccine called Phalanx. This period of history in Brooks's book is called The Great Denial, where everyone pretends that things are going to be normal, that African rabies is not a big deal. Next is The Great Panic, a chapter that focuses on the unraveling of American society as the zombie outbreaks become unmanageable and Americans flee their homes in a desperate bid to escape. We see how Indian civilians try to escape their own outbreak and how the Russian and American militaries are caught completely lacking when their delayed responses to the pandemic come far too late. It also covers ineffectual civilian responses to the plague, such as a bunch of ill-fated celebrities trying to wait it out on a Long Island fortress. The next chapter, Turning the Tide, describes the Rediker Plan, a plan of voluntarily abandoning land and establishing safe zones that become crucial to many nations' survival. It further details the German, Ukrainian, and Indian responses to the zombie threat and the lengths that they will go to ensure victory. Abandoning civilians and using chemical weapons on their own people are par for the course. Next, Homefront USA describes the various actions of the US government to prepare for the offensive against the zombies, the creating of the Department of Strategic Resources, dealing with both ferals and quislings, and the reformation of the US military, along with some more personal stories of survival. Around the World and Above continues the trend of the previous chapter, but details the resistance in other countries, such as the United Kingdom and Japan, and the fate of astronauts stuck up in the International Space Station. It also theorizes about the fate of North Korea, as all of its citizens have disappeared. Then, Total War. This chapter describes the global offensive against the zombies, from the Battle of Hope in New Mexico, brutal fighting beneath Paris, and the incredible meat grinder that is the Russian war against the undead. And then there is the final chapter, Goodbyes, giving some closing statements from some of the more notable interviewees. World War Z is really a collection of many different short stories contained in the same book. This format allows it to present many different scenarios at the cost of any deep characterization or perhaps a more fulfilling narrative. But that's something the realistic presentation helps to mitigate. It really does feel like a series of interviews that might have happened in real life. Author Max Brooks was able to show a whole swath of zombie scenarios, many of which would appear again in later zombie fiction. By telling the story through interviews, essentially small snapshots of the global crisis, Brooks is able to include just about every scenario you can think of. We see the perspective from Middle America, the Indian Army, Palestinian refugees, paraplegic volunteers, canine units, politicians, snake oil salesmen, astronauts, and filmmakers, to name just a few. Although Brooks absolutely succeeded in writing a series of gripping short narratives, his greatest success was undoubtedly the creation of this brilliantly realized setting in which all elements of the zombie plague's effect on human civilization are analyzed. Many countries, including China at the beginning, implement measures to stop the spread that seem to be working at first. The infected are rounded up and quarantined, presumably to be either euthanized or studied. In some places, it seems, for a while at least, that things are under control. I feel like this harkens back to Romero's earlier Dead films, where we see bands of rednecks going around and killing off the undead with ease, and radio and TV broadcasts continuing to inform the public. It seems for a while that everything will be fine without impacting everyone's lives too much. American Alpha teams successfully stamp out the initial outbreaks in the USA with extreme prejudice. But whereas Special Forces boots on the ground were a very popular method of dealing with the problem, it was only meant to be used for the short term. The US government fails to initiate the second phase of the operation. The administration is too scared of upsetting the American populace with drafting and getting on a wartime footing, and therefore refuses to implement this phase. The Rediker Plan calls for the abandonment of most parts of the country, the establishment of safe zones, and the relocation of military and government resources behind natural barriers. This plan, coldly logical as it was, made no sense to American leaders at a time when they seemed to be winning against the undead threat. The American government, and most others, had no idea how far the virus was spreading under their noses. If you watch a film like 2004's Dawn of the Dead, or 28 Days Later, really any film featuring the faster kind of zombie, it is kind of easy to believe that human civilization could fall to a zombie pandemic. With old Romero zombies, or the Solanum virus of Brooks's books, There seems to be no way that humanity could fail to repel the undead threat. These zombies are slow and show no sign of intelligence. And yet, whole countries fall to the zombies and untold millions of people die. How could this happen? Very simply, the answer lies with us. Human beings sabotaged themselves. In only the second account of the book, a human smuggler details how he helped to smuggle people out of China during the initial China localized outbreaks. However, Tibetan smugglers took advantage of the infected by peddling ideas of a miracle cure in the West, incentivizing them to fly to Europe in search of a cure. From there, the pandemic spread worldwide. Boat smugglers dump reanimated bodies onto beaches and shorelines, causing the infection to spread more easily and without detection. Illegally harvested human organs are flown from China to other parts of the world, carrying the disease with them. Greedy bastards such as Breckenridge Scott get rich off of the money they make from peddling a completely bogus vaccine for the Solanum virus named Phalanx. He ends up retreating to Antarctica, no doubt because the US government wants him dead, or at the very least tried for his abominable crimes, but he will never face justice. What's incredible is that he even gets the US president to endorse the miracle cure, a jab that is probably more relevant in our current political climate than ever before. The US government backs Phalanx purely on the hope that it will prevent widespread panic, and it does for a time. At almost every turn in this book, the human race finds a way to screw itself over. Which should be a disease just like any other we've faced in the past, indeed, one more easily contained than the likes of influenza or coronavirus, is given opportunities to spread. Even the country most prepared for the zombie plague, Israel, almost falls to human folly. Israel almost succumbs to an intense civil war between an extreme Jewish faction and the IDF. Rather than be open about the zombie problem, the Chinese create a diversion by creating a military incident in the Taiwan Strait to distract Americans from the zombie problem that's plaguing China. The Taiwan Strait incident causes the United States to be preparing for a traditional military conflict. They start preparing for World War III, not a massive global pandemic. And then, of course, there is the Battle of Yonkers. Brooks's attempt to show the US military failing to adapt to a crisis. Now, this part of the book has been very heavily criticized by people for being unrealistic, and I do have to agree. Brooks absolutely underestimated the military capacity of the US armed forces, both in strategy and in armaments. He portrays the US Army as basically a bunch of bungling idiots who can't figure out how to deal with zombies. I generally love social commentary in zombie media. In fact, I think that's why the genre exists. But this was a somewhat poor attempt to criticize the military industrial complex. Take, for example, this line. The second steel rain didn't have half the impact of the first. No more gas tanks to catch, and now the more tightly packed G's just happened to be shielding each other from a possible head wound. Ah, yes, the walking bags of shrapnel were protecting each other from head wounds, as opposed to, being blown into pieces. The truth is, Brooks could have shown the army being victorious at Yonkers just like the Alpha teams were. You don't really need the military to lose engagements with the undead for a country to still fall to them. Human nature can do the work for you. Outbreaks happening in unexpected places, people hiding their loved ones and their wounds, etc. There's a lot of ways you can write the problem to become so bad that society still collapses, even without the failure of the military in a traditional sense. If I were to rewrite it, perhaps, Yonkers could be lost simply due to the unsecured buildings that the army is set up near. After all, this is when the line begins to break in the book. A very evocative and awesome passage. Everyone pipe down, someone shouted. Hold the line! Stay off the net! An older voice, you could tell, but suddenly it was drowned out in this scream, and suddenly my eyepiece, and I'm sure everyone else's, was filled with the sight of blood spurting into a mouth of broken teeth. The sight was from a dude in the yard of a house behind the line. The owners must have left a few reanimated family members locked in when they bugged out. This part of the Yonkers account shows the American army being overwhelmed because of the actions of the US's own civilian population. This carelessness is part of the reason why it is so hard to contain an outbreak. People not killing the undead created from their own family, hoping in vain, perhaps for a cure. This is the factor that the Yonkers chapter should really have focused on. It's a much more logical reason for the failure of the battle at Yonkers. The point being that the fight against the undead is lost, at least temporarily, due to the folly of men. World War Z introduced a lot of unique concepts to the zombie apocalypse, and I'll talk about a couple of them. First, we have the ferals. The concept of ferals is simply enough. Children let loose by their parents at an early age who managed to somehow avoid the undead and survive throughout the years when the United States was overwhelmed by the zombie menace. Ferals proved to be a humanitarian crisis for the US to deal with, one that complicates their measures to clear the United States. They are human beings who can never be properly reintegrated into normal society. They represent at once the human will and spirit to survive, and also the children displaced in real life crises around the world. These feral children could be a very real consequence of any kind of natural disaster that leaves children stranded without adult care. Quislings, on the other hand, are the result of a bizarre psychological condition. These are people who have attempted to become zombies in some sense. Their mind breaks and causes them to start acting like zombies even though they aren't infected. As Joe Muhammad, a neighborhood watchman, puts it, there's a type of person who just can't deal with a fight or die situation. They're always drawn to what they're afraid of. Instead of resisting, they want to please it, join it, try to be like it. They started moving like zombies, sounding like them, even attacking and trying to eat other people. A member of Joe's crew is bitten by one such quisling and moves to execute himself. He was ready to do himself in until we discovered that the guy I shot had bright red blood pouring from his head. Quislings aren't just trying to blend in with the zombies. They've suffered such a profound psychological break that they believe themselves to be zombies. It doesn't save them from the living dead, however, who automatically devour them. The Quisling concept is quite silly, actually. No one acting like a zombie would survive very long in the zombie apocalypse, after all. They would all be devoured in the first few days, unless you're in a Shaun of the Dead kind of situation where you can fake it. Conceptually, however, they're very interesting. They serve as an example of the psychosomatic consequences of believing oneself to be ill. We've heard stories of people with Baron Munchausen syndrome, people who trick themselves and others into believing that they are sick. In a zombie apocalypse scenario, this kind of disorder could certainly manifest as believing oneself to be a zombie. In fact, I think that many different disorders could manifest in believing oneself to be infected, perhaps not actually moving around and moaning and trying to eat people, but I could definitely see false positives being a very real problem in a zombie outbreak. Every unidentified scratch or bruise on your skin, every close call with simply being near zombies, to say nothing of the fear of the plague going airborne. New mental illnesses based around zombie infection could become commonplace. Then, of course, there is another kind of mental disorder that comes about in this time. ADS, asymptomatic demise syndrome. This is a syndrome where people in the safe zones of the United States, on the west of the Rocky Mountains, simply one day fail to wake up. They die in their sleep with no known cause of death. Why? Well, they've simply given up. The incredible psychological shock and despair felt by the American population causes many, many deaths from this ADS alone. I felt that this was also a shockingly realistic take on crises. Sometimes people just wither away and die from the stress or the hopelessness of the situation that they are in. One last idea that isn't unique to this book, but which was handled very, very well, was the idea of rebels insurrectionists, and freedom fighters during the zombie pandemic. When the authority of the US government collapsed following the Great Panic, there were rebellions against the US government within the California safe zone. The president demands that these rebels be eliminated swiftly, decisively, and by any means necessary. These harsh measures are necessary because any compromising of the safe zone beyond the Rockies is an imminent threat to the American people's survival. However, there are rebels in the East as well, and this is a pricklier situation to deal with. To quote the Wacko, as the saying went, we didn't leave America, America left us. There's a lot of truth in that. We deserted those people. Yes, we left some Special Forces volunteers, tried to supply them by sea and air, but from a purely moral standing, these people were truly abandoned. The US government tries its best to allow for peaceful reintegration, but understandably and tragically, many of the communities that have gone their own way in the intervening years put up a strong fight for independence. I still have nightmares, he says. Places like Bolivar and the Black Hills. I never see the actual images, not the violence nor the aftermath. I always see my boss, this towering, powerful, vital man, getting sicker and weaker each time. I don't know if great times make great men, but I know they can kill them. The President of the United States withers away and eventually dies from the stress of his work, and much of it has to do not with the zombies, but from the mental strain of knowing that he is ordering American soldiers to kill their fellow American citizens. As much as World War Z depicts a relatively hopeful apocalypse, with many of our modern countries surviving the global pandemic and society rebuilding, the Wacko's interview ends here on a dark note. Not before the zombie outbreak has even ended, Americans are already killing other Americans in what could be called a second American Civil War. This is a grim reminder that nothing has really changed in human nature. In some places, the zombie plague ties people together closer than they have ever been. But here, we see the incredible division that the government's actions have caused. Sometimes, there isn't a perfect response. They say great times make great men. I don't buy it. I saw a lot of weakness, a lot of filth. People who should have risen to the challenge neither couldn't or wouldn't. Greed, fear, stupidity, and hate. I saw it before the war. I see it today. My boss was a great man. We were damn lucky to have him. This quote is from The Wacko once again, and it encapsulates everything I love about the portrayal of humanity in this story. We're talking about a global crisis created not really by the virus, but by the human response to it. In the end, however, humanity overcomes because of the actions of great people rising to the occasion. Although there are plenty of examples of human virtue in this story, we can start with two of the most significant personages of the zombie war, the unnamed President of the United States and Queen Elizabeth II, who is portrayed in this book as many of us here in the real world would like to remember her. Great Britain has some advantages in the zombie war, but some serious disadvantages as well. Her army must retreat all the way up into Scotland beyond the Antonine Wall, with the Grampian Mountains being one of the few natural boundaries in the UK that are sufficient to create a safe zone against the living dead. The country's lopsided population distribution leads to London becoming a teeming white zone, even well beyond the official end of the zombie war. However, Britain has some advantages as well. First, national unity. England is arguably the oldest nation-state in the world, with the English identity being traced all the way back to the days when King Alfred the Great declared himself Rex Anglo-Saxonorum, or Anglo-Saxon König. The Scots and the Welsh, with their similarly ancient history, are quick to unify in the face of the zombie menace. Another part of this ancient history is the heritage of castles brought over from the Normans. Britain is dotted with old Norman castles, many of them excellently maintained, and this proves to be a salvation for many British civilians. It is in Britain's most famous castle, Windsor, that we find Queen Elizabeth. The Queen is asked many times to evacuate the castle. Her family has fled to relatively safe Ireland, which acts as a temporary home for the Pope as well. Elizabeth refuses, however, recognizing the morale advantage of having the Queen in England, not even 100 kilometers away from infested London. How can a country resist, the Queen reasons, if her leader does not lead by example? David Forbes, one of the defenders of Windsor, describes the Queen's conduct. She wouldn't leave, you see. She insisted, over the objections of Parliament, to remain at Windsor for the duration. Why not join her family in Ireland or the Isle of Man, or at least Supreme Command HQ north above the Antonine? What did she say? Max asks the Englishman. The highest of distinctions is service to others. Her father had said that. It was the reason he had refused to run to Canada during the Second World War, the reason her mother had spent the Blitz visiting civilians huddled in the tube stations beneath London, the same reason to this day we remain a united kingdom. They were viewed much like castles, I suppose, as crumbling, obsolete relics with no real modern function other than as tourist attractions. But when the skies darkened and the nation called, both reawoke to the meaning of their existence. When I first read this book as a teenager, this was the best pro-royal propaganda I had ever read, and I managed for quite some time to be both a socialist and a monarchist. But beyond my personal experience, Brooks perfectly captures the self-sacrificing that the British royal family exemplified during the World Wars. This is the kind of behavior that made the British monarchy endure through the 20th century when so many others were abolished. It was the reason why, for much of English history, an American or any other foreigner insulting the king was grounds for a beating. In the years after the near universally beloved Queen's passing in our own timeline, support for the monarchy has lessened a great deal. Here in Canada, it was recently increased by the King's reaffirmation of Canadian sovereignty during a certain trade dispute with the United States. Many of us still have faith, however, that in a time of crisis, the king would be able to do the same as his predecessors have done and rise to the occasion for the sake of our commonwealth once again. The embodiment of a nation within one personage, one who is above mere politics, who can speak for the soul of the nation. This is the promise of the modern monarchy, and it gives the nation hope even in the darkest of hours. We can turn to the United States for another example. The need for humans to cling to their values is exemplified by the US president's decision to retake the continental United States by force. It is noted that Solenim zombies do rot away, slowly. They are avoided by bacteria and carrion eaters, but they are slowly whittled away by the decaying forces of nature. Many nations remain content to allow them to rot while humanity waits behind the fortified safe zones. The president, however, has the vision to know that this will not do. He notes that the United States does not have 1,000 years of history. It does not have a monolithic culture. It has only ideals to keep it together. If the US government does not fight for those ideals, the nation will never recover. The president's opinion is best summed up by the interviewee Ernesto Alguin from Chile, who describes the scene at the Honolulu conference. We'd fought the living dead to a stalemate, and eventually future generations might be able to re-inhabit the planet with little or no physical danger. Yes, our defensive strategies had saved the human race, but what about the human spirit? The living dead had taken more from us than land and loved ones. They'd robbed us of our confidence as the planet's dominant life form. We were a shaken, broken species, driven to the edge of extinction and grateful only for a tomorrow with perhaps a little less suffering than today. Was this the legacy we would leave to our children? A level of anxiety and self-doubt not seen since our simian ancestors cowered in the tallest trees? What kind of world would they rebuild? Would they rebuild at all? Could they continue to progress, knowing that they had been powerless to reclaim their future? And what if the future saw another rise of the living dead? Would our descendants rise to meet them in battle, or simply crumble to meek surrender and accept what they believed to be their inevitable extinction? For this reason alone, we had to reclaim our planet. We had to prove to ourselves that we could do it, and leave that as the war's greatest monument. The new United Nations, comprised of only 72 member states, narrowly votes to go on the offensive. Here, the best of humanity is exemplified. It is the human spirit that has allowed us to conquer the hardships of the past, all the plagues and wars and famines and calamities that have affected the human race since time immemorial. Brooks transforms the war against the undead from one for mere survival into a war for the human soul. Humanity has survived, the worst has passed, but is survival all that we were meant to achieve? Is our destiny not greater than this? Because World War Z is a setting in which human civilization never entirely collapses, it can use the zombie plague to explore such topics. We can ask, when our safety is more or less assured, what price will we pay for freedom and for the good of our own spirit? There are plenty of other examples in this text of great moments of humanity. I have to mention General Raj Singh, for instance, the military genius who invents the modified pike and shot formation that becomes the standard procedure for fighting the undead. Despite his immense importance as a military mind, the general immediately leaps into action to prevent disaster when the charges meant to destroy the mountain passes into northern India fail to detonate. Something had gone wrong with the charges that were buried half a kilometer down the road, right in the middle of the refugees. This is the end, I thought. We're all going to die. Thank God for General Raj Singh. He reacted exactly how you might expect a living legend to react. He ordered us to get out of here, save ourselves, and get to Shimla, then turned and ran right into the crowd. Mukherjee and I looked at each other, without much hesitation, I'm happy to say, and took off after him. The actions of the general inspire his men to heroism, even though they aren't able to do much and almost get trampled to death in the process. General Raj Singh demonstrates the incredible self-sacrifice that people are capable of in the name of their nation, their friends, and their family. We see yet more examples of heroism through the eyes of journalist and film producer Roy Elliott, who is on a mission to defeat asymptomatic demise syndrome, ADS, the syndrome killing Americans well beyond the west of the Rockies. Elliott braves the roads of greater Los Angeles to Claremont, where he finds the defenders of Scripps College. Essentially, while everyone else was running to the hills to flee Los Angeles, these students fortified the college campus and held out. While the mountains burned around them and the surrounding suburbs descended into violence, those 300 kids held off 10,000 zombies. 10,000 over the course of 4 months until the Inland Empire could finally be pacified. We were lucky to get there just at the tail end, just in time to see the last of the undead fall, as cheering students and soldiers linked up under the oversized, homemade Old Glory fluttering from the Pomona Bell Tower. Elliott's film captures the fighting spirit of the American people, showing their tenacity and bravery and bringing hope to a defeated nation. Brooks uses zombies as a stand-in for just about any disaster you could think of, and shows how the human spirit is capable of enduring and even thriving in the greatest hardships. Yet victory against the undead is not attained without making some very difficult and even unethical choices. It's no Operation Cobalt, but the Rediker plan requires an unemotional and disgustingly rational course of action. This plan is the brainchild of one Paul Rediker, a South African strategist who had originally designed a similar plan for the apartheid South African government in a worst-case scenario. The plan is simplified somewhat by the enemy being automatons rather than humans with more predictable patterns. Rediker's plan is reluctantly adopted by almost every government in the world. The Canadian government abandons all of Canada east of the Rockies, and the US government does the same, basing much of their activity in California. The details are described to us by Azania, a South African scholar of Rediker, to put it lightly. A scholar of Rediker. First of all, there was no way to save everyone. The outbreak was far too gone. The armed forces had already been too badly weakened to effectively isolate the threat, and spread so thinly across the country they could only grow weaker by the day. Our forces had to be consolidated, withdrawn to a special safe zone, which hopefully would be aided by some natural obstacle such as mountains, rivers, or even an offshore island. Once concentrated in this zone, the armed forces could eradicate the infestation within its borders and use what resources were available to defend it against further onslaughts of the living dead. That was the first part of the plan, and it made as much sense as any conventional military retreat. It is the second part of the plan, the evacuation of civilians, that is truly controversial and some would say downright evil. Only a small fraction of the civilian population will be brought to a safe area. However, other civilians will not be simply abandoned. They will be given aid, but not for the sake of preserving their lives or helping them beat back the infected. Azania continues. There was another reason for this partial evacuation, an eminently logical and insidiously dark reason that many believe will forever ensure Rediker the tallest pedestal in the pantheon of hell. Those who were left behind were to be herded into special isolated zones. They were to be human bait, distracting the undead from following the retreating army into the safe zone. Rediker argued that these isolated, uninfected refugees must be kept alive, well defended, and even resupplied if possible, so as to keep the undead hordes firmly rooted to the spot. In Hamburg, we see an example of the rolling out of the Rediker plan. Essentially, the army retreats to Schleswig-Holstein, one of Germany's most isolated northern regions, creating a safe zone there. Supplies are given to isolated communities within Germany, areas that have been sufficiently fortified so as not to be overrun. Here's the kicker. These areas aren't meant to be held out permanently. Yes, the people defending them are trying to survive as long as possible, but for the armed forces and the government, these areas are meant only to be temporary distractions for the living dead. They will be aided just enough for them to hold out as long as possible in these so-called blue zones. Many will outlast the zombie conflict through careful use of government supplies, but others will eventually be overrun. The immense human cost of Rediker's measures is tragic. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide are left to die by their governments, many while still being promised aid. This is the brutality of the zombie apocalypse, and it mirrors a real-life pandemic situation. If not enough is done to stop the disease in its early stages, we will be forced to make terrible sacrifices. Those of us living in the post-COVID-19 world can feel this distinctly. Many of us will have memories of quarantine, both voluntary and involuntary, during the worst parts of the global pandemic. We can remember the small but noticeable sacrifices that we had to make during the worst of COVID, and greater sacrifices made in China during the height of the pandemic there. World War Z is a similar scenario, just 1,000 times worse, and it prepares us, the readers, for what might be in our own futures. Few still remember when the bombers flew overhead in Europe, or the wartime rationing in Britain, France, Germany, for instance. For many, even quite a few people who watch this video, the horrors of war and disaster are still a very real presence. You may have felt them yourself. For us in the cozy West, books like World War Z can serve as a reminder of the harsh, unsentimental decisions that our forefathers had to make, and which we may someday have to make ourselves. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the kind of hopeful post-apocalypse of this book. It's one of the more realistic zombie apocalypse scenarios. It's realistic because, unlike so many other zombie stories, humanity wins. By the time the narrator is sent by the UN Commission to compile his report, the world has already returned to relative normalcy, although things have changed dramatically from how the world was before. I mean, more than half of the global population has died. Many survivors of the war find themselves being recruited into new professions, those that are needed in the new society that is emerging during and after the conflict. Arthur Sinclair, the director of the Department of Strategic Resources, or DSTRESS, explains the department's policy of putting survivors to work. There was starvation, disease, homelessness in the millions. Industry was in shambles, transportation and trade had evaporated, and all of that was compounded by the living dead both assaulting the rocky line and festering within our safe zone. We had to get our people on their feet again, clothed, fed, housed, and back to work. The only problem is that many of the trades all these refugees had been doing for a living are now a thing of the past. Most jobs in entertainment have evaporated, and management and executive positions are for companies that are now functionally gone, destroyed. We needed carpenters, masons, machinists, gunsmiths. We had those people, to be sure, but not nearly as many as were necessary. We required a massive job retraining program. In short, we needed to get a lot of white collars dirty. Many former office workers are recruited for unskilled labor, while those with relevant skills are recruited to teach these people the skills needed to exist in the new world. In a kind of office space twist, it turns out that many of these workers become very satisfied with their new trades. He tells us, I met one gentleman on a coastal ferry from Portland to Seattle. He had worked in the licensing department for an advertising agency. Now he was a chimney sweep. Given that most homes in Seattle had lost their central heat and the winters were now longer and colder, he was seldom idle. I helped keep my neighbors warm, he said proudly. That was the upshot of a more localized system. It gave people the opportunity to see the fruits of their labor. It gave them a sense of individual pride to know they were making a clear, concrete contribution to victory. Although we have a sense that these changes will no doubt revert in the post war years as humanity expands once again, for the moment it seems as though the zombie plague has forged closer ties between people. Alienation and dissatisfaction with one's work is such a common theme nowadays, and it's easy to relate with the kind of zombified office worker who lives his life in a kind of haze, barely cognizant of the passage of days. In an ironic turn, the zombie apocalypse has de-zombified much of the US population, revitalizing the American community, at least for a time. A further example of this would be the case of Kondo Tatsumi. A hikikomori and an otaku, Tatsumi is disconnected from Japanese society and his cultural heritage. Upon finding the body of his neighbor Reiko, who had committed suicide, he laments his inability to give her any kind of rites after death. What bothered me most was that I didn't know any prayers for the dead. I'd forgotten what my grandparents had tried to teach me as a little kid, rejecting it as obsolete data. It was a shame how out of touch I was with my heritage. All I could do was stand there like an idiot and whisper an awkward apology for taking some of her sheets. Yet the zombie apocalypse gave Tatsumi a chance to change things for the better. He meets Tomonaga Ijiro, a hibakusha, a blind survivor of the bombing of Hiroshima. Ijiro not only teaches him how to survive, but also gives him a new purpose in life. Ijiro himself gains a new purpose in his usefulness as a martial artist, destroying thousands of undead using his keen sense of hearing. One man had rejected society, the other had been discarded by it. Now, in the new world, they are playing a critical role in helping others become prepared for the return of the zombie threat. Japan could not be allowed to wither and die. We would care for her. We would preserve her. We would annihilate the walking blight that infested and defiled her, and we would restore her beauty and purity for the days when her children would return to her. I told him that we might be fighting 50 million monsters, but those monsters would be facing the gods. Tomonaga's actions not only play an important role in cleansing Japan, but he also helps to revitalize the dead spirituality of the country. As in the USA, we see that the conflict has brought some people back to life, revitalizing them and giving their lives meaning. I could talk about every little bit of World War Z endlessly. This book defined my teenage years in a way I can't begin to explain. It turned me into a huge zombie nerd. It introduced me to the realm of creators like George A. Romero and Tom Savini. It shaped my taste in horror, history, and social commentary in a way that no book is likely to ever do again. It's rare for me to feel that I owe a debt to any particular work or author, but I do feel that way towards World War Z. It is, as I said, a singular work of fiction. It takes the well worn tropes of the zombie genre and places them in an utterly unique framing device. What it really shows us, more than anything, is that the story is in the telling. The decision to depict this book as an oral history was a stroke of genius by Brooks and one that I hope is someday replicated with a new spin. For now, however, the book stands alone at the top of its genre.